Hi, I am Sandy Walsick. I am the forest manager for the Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and I'm going to talk to you today about trees and forest management in general. I'm out here at our Surrey Forest property, which is one of the large lands that the trust owns on the Blue Hill Peninsula. But the things I'm going to chat with you about today are things that you could apply on your property, that would work anywhere in a forest. They're pretty specific to the forests of Maine, particularly eastern Maine, but these same principles would probably work anywhere. So again, we're out here today at Surrey Forest, and I'm not sure how many of you have walked around Surrey Forest, but it is a pretty young forest. It was very heavily harvested about 5 years ago, and it was what was called liquidation harvested. So that means pretty much everything of value was cut on this property and removed to be sold for timber purposes and other purposes. So it's a really young forest, and that is the case with a lot of forests in Maine and eastern Maine in particular. So we have a lot of land around here that was cut usually for commercial timber harvest, sometimes for development or fields or other things. So a lot of what people are seeing and working with in their own yards and their own properties is this young forest that's probably somewhere, between 5 and 25 years old. And so the forest that we have here, a lot of it is pretty small trees. Trees maybe this size, this tree next to me, 7 or 8 inches in diameter, and maybe 25 to 50 feet tall is a lot of the forest that we have around here. And a lot of it's very dense growth. If you can see the forest around me, there's lots of trees within a very small area. So that's what our forest looks like here, and this is what a lot of the questions and a lot of things I talk to people about is what do I do with this forest? Most people don't own 2,000 acres like Surrey Forest. Most people might own 5 acres, 10 acres, 50 acres. There's a lot of small woodlot owners in Maine, and most land in Maine is privately owned, and so small woodlot owners, while you just own a couple of acres, actually as a whole, small woodlot owners have a huge impact on the overall forest of Maine. And so figuring out how you want to manage your small forest, what do you want to do with it, your individual choices on your property can actually have a really big impact on the overall forest health and state of the forest in Maine. So I want to help people to figure out a couple of sort of an introduction to how you might go about managing your own forest. One of the most important things when you're thinking about what you want to do with your property is just figuring out what do you have, what is on your land. And I know that seems like a pretty obvious question, but it's a pretty big question. A forest, there obviously are trees, but there's a lot of other things to think about, from the soils that you have to the terrain to the wildlife that's on your property to your trail system and how accessible it is. So usually the first thing I recommend to people is to start to figure out what you have on your property. If on one end, some people will go out and hire either a forester, a professional forest manager, to come and do a pretty detailed inventory of their property, to count and measure the trees and write a report for you. And that's a really great option if you're interested in managing your forest. You can hire someone to do that work for you. On the other end, though, and a good place to start is figuring out where your property lines are and just walking around your property and seeing what you have. A lot of people who have owned land might have never walked to the back of their acreage and know what's all across their landscape. So you can, get a field guide to trees and start to figure out what species of trees do I have here. What does my terrain look like? Is it very wet here? Is it very rocky? Do I have wetlands? What kind of wildlife am I seeing? Now in the winter is a great time to go out and look for tracks on your property, and you can start to get an idea of what kind of wildlife that you have. So starting to get a baseline and figure out what's on your land is really the best place to start. And again, that can range anywhere from you doing your own work to hiring a professional to do your work. If you're new to forests and you've maybe moved to this area, or you've just never spent a lot of time in your woods, getting field guides and just getting comfortable being out in the woods is a great place to start. If you want to do more detailed management and have a timber harvest or something like that, or really do intensive work on your property, I really would recommend hiring a forester or someone like that to do a detailed inventory of your property and find out that information. If you can see, actually, the trees around us where we're standing here, this is part of a permanent research plot that we're putting in at Surrey Forest, in working with some local schools to do this. And so these trees are numbered, and we will measure each one of them, and year after year we'll come back and remeasure these trees. And so this is a really intensive example of how you might start to figure out what's on your property and the growing conditions. Not everyone has to do this, but it's a fun thing if you have the extra time to figure it out. So once you've got an idea of what's on your property, other great resources you can use. Also, there's lots of resources online now that even 5 or 10 years ago might not have been available. So there's lots of great mapping resources. If you hire someone to make a plan, they'll make you all kinds of maps for your property. But you can also just go online and, starting with Google Earth or other really simple things, everyone's got a phone in their pocket for the most part, or they have access to a computer, and you can look at your property on Google Earth in really great detail. There's all kinds of other information offered by the state of Maine. The Office of GIS has tons and tons of maps that you can go online. You don't need any special software. You can just look at all of that on your computer to get a good idea of what your property is. And it really helps for those things sometimes to know your tax map and lot number, and you can reference that stuff to look at your specific property, which is a really great resource available to people. So once you've figured out generally what you have across your landscape, the next idea is the next thing to do is to figure out what you want to do with your land. And that answer could be nothing. I just want to have my land and enjoy it, and that's a perfectly good answer that a lot of people have. But some folks want to harvest commercial timber or harvest firewood for their own use. A lot of people want to improve wildlife habitat. Maybe you want more deer habitat or more grouse habitat, or maybe you love migratory songbirds and you want to improve habitat for them. Maybe you want to be harvesting wild edible foods off of your landscape. There's a whole range of things that people would like to do from their land. And so for each of those things, once you've figured out what you have, you can work on managing for those specific aspects. And this is another place where you can do it on your own. You can also hire a forest manager to come and really help you if you have some more intensive objectives that you want to accomplish. So we're going to look now at a couple of different forest stands at Surrey Forest, and I'm just going to give you an idea of what's going on those stands and what you might be thinking about when you're managing for your property. One of the things to keep in mind when figuring out what your objectives for your land are is that you have to really be working with what you have. So the forest has amazing resources available to you, but you also have to manage it within the bounds of what is available on your property. So depending on what trees you have, what soils you have, and what's going on in your landscape, that really should help you figure out what your objectives are. If you have a spruce fir forest that's dense spruce fir and you want hardwood firewood off of it, that's going to be tricky for you to figure out. So you really have to work with the forest that you have and be realistic about what your expectations for that forest are. Out here in the Surrey Forest, we've got a ton going on, but it's a very young forest, so we won't be doing a high value commercial harvest of veneer logs for probably 80 years, if not more, out here. And so because I've figured out what's on this landscape, we know that and we can plan according. So that's what you should be thinking to do on your own property. If you're looking to buy property, then you can have those objectives in mind while you're looking for land and go about it that way. So as you can see, the forest that we're standing in now, again, pretty much all the forest out at Surrey Forest is very young. The trees behind me, there's not that many species out here. There's 67 species of trees in the state of Maine, but the majority of those that are for commercial purposes and grow to large sizes, it's a much smaller number than that. So one easy thing about the forest in Maine is that if you learn just a handful of trees, you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on in the woods, and you can identify most common trees. So a lot of the trees, like the one next to me, are a species of what people around here refer to as poplar. They're aspen trees. These are quaking aspen trees, but you might also have big tooth aspen trees. Obviously easier to identify trees in the summer when hardwood trees have leaves if you're new to it. But once you get accustomed to it, you'll figure out how to identify hardwood trees in the winter without leaves. It's not as hard as you think. If you work on it for a while, I'm sure you can figure it out. So this stand behind me is, again, a pretty dense young stand. It has these young aspen or poplar trees. It's got clumps of small red maple trees. It's got some balsam fir growing in it, and that's the majority of the species that's growing right around here. So again, not a huge diversity of species. But what I can tell from this species, or the species mix and how they're growing and their size and density, is that, like I said, this stand was pretty heavily harvested and opened up to a lot of sunlight. Trees like poplars, they are what's called shade intolerant. They like to grow, and they need to grow in really open, sunny areas. So when you see a lot of these trees, you can tell that at some point in time your landscape was opened up and was very sunny, and so these young trees will grow up. Clumps of red maple, if you see clumps of red maple on your landscape, you can also tell that that tree was cut at some point, and red maple does what's called stump sprouting. So if you cut off a big red maple, it'll shoot out a bunch of young saplings from that stump, and you get these clumps around your landscape that a lot of people will notice. Red maple is a very hardy tree. It will grow pretty much anywhere in pretty much any conditions around here, so it's one of our most common trees. Same thing with balsam fir. Balsam fir is the most abundant tree in the state of Maine by number. It's very common. You'll see it on most properties around here, and it pretty much grows anywhere. It likes to grow. It'll grow well in shadier conditions, so it's growing, as you can see, under the overstory of these poplar and red maple trees. So with my young forest in here, that will help me figure out my objectives. I have enough red maple to be maybe managing this area for firewood. Red maple is a good firewood tree. I also know that this property, over time, these poplars are going to grow up, and they're probably not going to regenerate under here. I'm going to have a different forest of trees which are more what's called shade tolerant, like my firs growing up under here. So it really, what I have here means that my objectives will vary for this property here, but that's where my baseline is. We are going to walk over to a couple different types of forests now, and we're going to check those out and just see what we have and think about what having different forest types might mean for what we can do for management and our different objectives. Okay, we are here at a different stand to look at, and here, as you can see, we're kind of in an oak pine stand. So oak pine is a really great productive forest type that we have around here. It's usually on a bit sandier, more well-drained soils. Both of those species like to grow in those conditions, so you often find them growing together. The oak that we have around here, these oak trees above me, we mostly have red oak in this part of Maine. There are other oak species that grow here, but for the most part, if you have big oak trees growing on your property, you probably have red oak. And the pine that we have is mostly white pine, which I think most people are familiar with, our state tree. So again, a really common forest type that you find growing together. And you'll notice as you start to get familiar with your property and just walking around woods that there's certain forest types that grow together. And these are just tree species that have similar growing conditions, similar soil and moisture needs and all that sort of thing. And so you'll very often find these tree species growing together. And so again, here, pine and oak. And another interesting thing about both of these species and why they might both grow together is because they both have similar light requirements. So both of these tree species, when they're little seedlings and getting established, they need to have a relatively high amount of light. So these are not tree species that grow up in the shade. We have lots of species in Maine that grow in shady conditions. Spruce and fir, hemlock, sugar maple, those are all species that can grow up in pretty shady conditions. But these two species, red oak and white pine, need much more light to grow. So I know about this stand. If I have red oak and white pine growing here, I know that I've got pretty well-drained soils, And I know that at some point this area was fairly open or fairly cleared for both of these species to be able to establish here. So as you get to know species and you get to know your woodlot, you can start to figure out just the growing characteristics and the conditions that your property had. And you can start to actually think backward about what the conditions might have been there when this forest established. That then also helps you think about what conditions you might have to create if you want to maintain this type of forest. So if I want to keep having oak and pine grow here, at some point I'm going to have to open this stand up quite a bit to let enough light in that I can regenerate these species. And again, this is all things that you certainly, if you're working with a forester or a forest manager, that they would work with you on to figure out, more of the details of this. And it's a trait called the sylvics of a tree. Silviculture is the study of how trees grow and their different needs. So that's kind of a whole science and the more you learn about it, the more you'll begin to understand how and why your forest is growing like it is. So the takeaways, I take away those things from the stand. Those are the things I've learned about it. And then I think about, okay, what might I manage this stand for? I've got this beautiful oak pine stand. Certainly oak is a wonderful firewood. So if you're looking to get firewood off of your property, oak is a great tree to do that with. Oak, if you are managing for firewood, keep in mind that you should dry oak out for 2 years, not just 1 year, before you burn it in your fire for safety's sake. So if you're harvesting the stand for firewood, though, if you just go ahead and cut out a bunch of the oak, you have to keep in mind that unless you open up those areas for light, you're probably not going to generate more oak. And so as you're managing your forest and as you are sort of taking products off of your land, if that's your management objective, you want to always think about what the future condition of that forest is going to be. So it's really easy to just go and cut a couple cords of firewood per year off your property, but you really want to be thinking about the impact that has on your actual land and on the future forest, especially if you're going to be doing more large-scale harvesting and that kind of thing. You want to be managing the current forest and taking the resources that you need off of it, always with an eye for the impact that you're having on the future forest that's going to be there. And white pine and oak are also both very valuable as timber species, or they can be if they're well-formed. Most of our tree species will have a relatively high timber value if they're nice and tall and straight, and they will have much less of a timber value if they're small and have a lot of limbs and a lot of rot in them. But both of these tree species can be really valuable if you did want to have a timber harvest. And again, there's a lot involved in thinking about how to do that right, how to plan for the future. So if you are going to have a bigger timber harvest, I really would recommend talking to some professional about that to some extent. There's also lots of wildlife value on these properties, especially the oak tree. And oak is what we call a mast species. So mast is just any food source that's produced by, in this case, a tree. And so really important masts are things like acorns that's produced by the oak trees, things that have a lot of nutritional value for wildlife species. So oak trees are one of our most important mast-producing species. The acorns that they drop feed a huge host of wildlife species, and they really, they provide a lot of fat and a lot of calories, and they're super important for so many wildlife species. So if you're managing for wildlife, having a healthy, productive oak stand is a really great way to improve your wildlife species. And just to note that the oak trees, they won't mast every year, so they will I think it's 3 to 7 years they'll produce a crop of acorns, and you'll notice the huge abundance of acorns some years and very little acorns in other years. And very important for wildlife. And as you're managing this stand, you can have multiple objectives. Maybe you're managing for wildlife and for firewood and for timber. You don't have to manage for one to the exclusion of the other. There's a lot that you can do in one particular forest type. So again, oak pine is a really great kind of stand. There's so many other forest types that we can talk about, and maybe we'll visit another site and talk about different conditions out on our woodlot properties. Okay, so what we're at, as you can see behind me, is not a forest stand per se, but this is a wetland complex at Steward Forest, and I want to come to the Wetland Complex because obviously if you own property around here, there is a lot of wetland, and maybe you have forested wetland, which grows trees on it but still has wetland soils, and also a lot of times you have other kinds of wetlands. This behind me is a pretty big beaver flowage, so it's a stream, and when they created this road, which was created as a logging road years ago, they built it sort of over as a causeway over what was a stream and a small beaver flowage. And since then, the beaver have gotten busy and built a bunch of dams and created this kind of big wetland complex. And beaver wetlands are an amazing ecological resource. They bring so much diversity to a landscape. They can be difficult for managing because if you have culverts or a small bridge or something, the beaver will kind of continually try to block that. We deal with that here, and we're working on it by installing different devices and trying to keep the road, maintain the road while also letting the beaver stay here and keep this really interesting, amazing habitat. And so if you're thinking about managing your property or working on your woodlot or working on your property, if you have wetlands are a huge source of diversity, wildlife diversity on a property. And so it's really important when you're thinking about managing your forest land for whatever reason that you think about how that might impact the wetlands that you have on your property. And if you do have wetlands, there's so many things here if you're looking to improve wildlife habitat or harvest edible or medicinal plants. Wetlands are the place to go to find a lot of that stuff. Right along the edges here of our wetland, we've got a bunch of elderberry, and we have a lot of other species that grow up in here that can be eaten or used for things, and it's very valuable to wildlife. Moose and deer, bobcat, coyotes, otters, beaver, all manner of turtles and birds use this relatively small area, and it concentrates all of those things. So it's really important for us thinking about managing our forests to maintain this and keep it as healthy as we possibly can, which is something that you can think about on your own property as well. Another thing you might notice if you have wetlands on your property, if you have a property that was heavily cut at some point, as a lot of properties were, oftentimes around the edges of wetland is where more mature forest has been maintained. A lot of times they did not cut right up to the wetland, and so you might find those bigger, older trees in that really unique habitat along the edge of the wetland. And there's really cool forest types like cedar or red maple swamps that will generally just grow in those really wet areas or along the edges of wetlands. And so you can find some really, really amazing habitat in your wetland areas. So when you go out and you first start to look at your property, I would recommend trying to figure out where your wetlands are. And that might be tiny little wetlands, or it might be temporary things like vernal pools where amphibians will breed. There's a whole lot going on for wetlands that isn't just your big streams and your big ponds and all that sort of thing across your landscape. And again, that's something that if you go on the state mapping service, you can find a lot of that mapped for your property. You can also look at topography. Usually where there's wet areas is low places in the topography, and so you can find maps of where the low areas are in your property, and you can check those out and see if there's wetlands there. Another cool thing and what brings diversity to these areas is the edge of the wetland. So that's another thing to focus on your property if you're thinking about wildlife and diversity is edge habitat, a gradient from sort of small trees to big trees where there's a whole lot of structural diversity going on. Will also bring in a bunch of wildlife species. Songbirds love to nest in that thick growth along the edge of wetlands and the edge of other openings. So there's a ton going on in wetlands, and any kind of forest management in Maine, you're probably going to have to think about wetlands. And like I said, this road was built across this wetland. In hindsight, we probably wouldn't maybe recommend that because it'll always be difficult to maintain, and it might have impaired the hydrology of this wetland. So were we to be building a road today, we might think about it differently and do something differently. And that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about accessing your property. How am I going to make access to this property, and how can I keep the wetlands healthy and not impair them when I'm doing that? So all really important things to think about. There's so much more to talk about when you're thinking about forest management. I mean, I could probably talk for another hour just about wetlands. So if you have property and you're interested in managing it and you're interested in learning more about it, there's a lot of amazing resources out there. You're welcome to visit trust properties and see what we've got going on for managing our lands and how we do things. The Maine Forest Service is a great resource for this stuff. The state offers tons of mapping. There's other state entities like Fish and Wildlife and the Maine Natural Areas Program that have so much information. There's tons of other organizations from Audubon to the Nature Conservancy, lots of other small local groups. Maine Woodlot Owners is a great group, and many that I haven't mentioned. But there's lots of free resources out there. There's just so much information available. I'd really recommend just getting out on your land, buy a good guide to trees and wildlife, just explore, figure out what you have, and then if you do have some more management objectives, there's a lot of resources to learn more about that. And if you do want to do intensive management or any kind of harvesting, I really would recommend talking to a forester to get some more detailed information about what you have going on out there. But yeah, just get on your property and explore and enjoy your woodlot.